Now, the South African Weather Service is warning of widespread rain, possible flooding, and of course, extreme heat in certain parts of the country. The Weather Service has issued an orange level 9 and an orange level 6 warning for disruptive rainfall over the eastern parts of Limpopo and Mpumalanga. South Africa has experienced high levels of rainfall across northern parts of the country over the past few weeks, and experts have warned that the recent floods in South Africa serve as a stark reminder of the increasing risks posed by extreme weather events. Now, to help us take a look at these floods and their impact, we join now by the Director of Global Change Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand, Professor Francois Engelbrecht. Professor Engelbrecht, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina. Thank you very much for having me.
So to what extent can climate change be linked to the intensity and the frequency of the sort of disruptive rainfall that we are seeing now in the latest instance in parts of Limpopo and Mpumalanga?
Sakina, across the world, we are seeing how extreme weather events are occurring more frequently and they are also becoming more severe. Statistics show us that this is happening literally in every part of the world. So also here in South Africa, if we look at the statistics of the last 4 decades or so, we can see a clear increase in the number of heavy rainfall events, specifically in the eastern provinces of South Africa. So it starts in the northern parts of the Eastern Cape, then of course right through KwaZulu-Natal and then into Mpumalanga and Limpopo, especially in the Lowveld and along the escarpment. And it's actually not too difficult to understand what's happening here. It's all about the fact that the atmosphere is getting warmer, so it can carry more and more moisture because of global warming. And then the Indian Ocean, east of South Africa, is of course an important source of moisture for weather systems. And the sea surface temperatures in the ocean are today substantially higher than, say, 40 years ago. And that means there's more evaporation. So when a tropical low pressure system forms, like has happened in this specific flood event we are now looking at in South Africa, there's just so much more water vapor available than, say, 4 decades ago. And that's why we are getting more intense rainfall than we were supposed to have been getting from these weather systems. So this is certainly an increasing risk, specifically in the eastern provinces of South Africa.
And just looking at that, we've been hearing from our meteorologists here during the weather forecast about La Nina, about cut-off lows and those sort of things. But of course, to lay people, we struggle with those terms in terms of what they actually mean and what we can expect.
It's true. So our country is affected by a number of different weather systems that can be dangerous. And in this specific case, it's a tropical low pressure system that is causing the heavy falls of rain. So many viewers may be more familiar with the tropical cyclone. So that is the most intense version of this type of weather system. But what has happened here is this tropical low formed over the Mozambique Channel. It gathered a lot of moisture. And at the end of last week, it was already causing flooding and very, very heavy falls of rain over the southern parts of Mozambique. But then what happened last weekend, it was on Friday night, the cloud bands of this weather system first moved westwards over the border into South Africa. And then, of course, the heavy falls of rain started last Sunday. And then every day in this past week, effectively had heavy falls of rain somewhere in Limpopo and Mpumalanga. These weather systems can cause staggering amounts of rainfall. So I suspect that what we will see once we have all the statistics of this week, there will be several weather stations that probably are going to report in the order of 500 millimeters of rain this week. So those are very, very big amounts. And that's, of course, why the rivers in Limpopo and now Mpumalanga in the eastern parts are in flood.
And Prof, if you could just put that into context for us when we talk about 500 millimeters of rain, just contextualize that for us. If we receive about 50 millimeters of rain, what does that mean? And if it goes to an extreme of 500, what are we looking at?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think many South Africans are, of course, familiar with the East Coast, the KwaZulu-Natal coast specifically. Now, along that coast, in places such as Durban, the annual rainfall is about 1,000 millimeters. That's the average annual rainfall. So if we now get 500 millimeters of rain, half the annual rainfall of Durban in 3 to 5 days, that's of course an amount of rainfall that can easily saturate the soils, and then we have more runoff into the rivers. Now, you also mentioned La Nina, and this is a La Nina summer, and many parts of Mpumalanga and the Limpopo lowveld also reported very high rainfall in December. So there are several weather stations that reported more than 200 millimeters of rain falling in December. So that means the soil moisture levels were already very high, soils were already saturated, the river levels were already high, and then suddenly we have this 500 millimeters of rain in just a few days' time. So that's of course a very, very dangerous recipe for flash flooding and more large-scale flooding, exactly what we are seeing now.
And is that localized, Prof, or is this part of a broader trend?
This specific event, so far, has been largely confined to the areas east of the escarpment, in the lowveld of Mpumalanga and Limpopo. So these rain bands are now also spreading southwards into the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal. So it's specifically this, we can call it the northeastern part, the northeastern corner of South Africa that has been affected most by this event. But the general trend of South Africa becoming more flood prone in the east, as I've mentioned already, we've all seen the evidence in recent years, and we are also looking at the statistics. So we are seeing that in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, the flood risk from cut-off lows, that is certainly rising. So we've already seen a doubling of heavy rainfall events associated with these systems over the last 40 years. And then the tropical lows, they are also becoming more dangerous, as I've explained, because they are linked to this warmer Indian Ocean. And they mostly affect the northeastern parts of the country, Mpumalanga and Limpopo, but on exceptional instances, they can also move as far south and affect especially the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal. So it's the entire eastern South Africa that is really increasingly at risk of these weather systems because of climate change.
And then if we look, Prof, at the models that the weather services are using, are they able to accurately and timelessly predict this so that, you know, we do have those warnings timelessly? Because in the case of Limpopo and Mpumalanga now, we did hear from the weather services that they issued that level 9 orange warning. And so are we in good nick as South Africa as far as the models and predicting what's to come?
In general, these numerical weather prediction models, nowadays also enhanced by AI systems, are increasingly accurate and are in general really reliable to give us warning of such an event occurring maybe typically 3 days before the event happens. So quite often the weather service is able to issue these warnings in a reliable way 3 days ahead of the event. Now, these tropical lows, I should say, are some of the most difficult weather systems in the world to predict the specific tracks that they will follow. It's more difficult to predict their trajectories than it is for the cut-off lows, which are big weather systems coming from the Southern Ocean. These are much smaller, more localized weather systems, the tropical lows. Now, in this specific case, the numerical weather prediction models already last week, Wednesday, started to give early warning of a heavy rainfall event in Limpopo and Mpumalanga provinces. And I did look at some of the weather service warnings going out, and I think the weather service, as you indicated, gave ample warning of this event well ahead of time. There are cases, of course, where the science doesn't get it right, where the forecasting is not perfect, but in general, we have a reliable early warning process in South Africa. The biggest challenge is how we respond to warnings. We often find ourselves not evacuating as South Africans ahead of a flood warning. And that's something that we need to work on. We need to make it easier for communities to evacuate. Because if you must leave your home for, say, 3 days or a week, that's not so easy. Where are you going to stay? Will you be safe? Where can you find food and water? Who will look after your property? So we need to think more about how to evacuate people safely in South Africa, maybe thousands of people ahead of an extreme weather event, because these events are just going to get more frequent and more intense.
So to that point, in terms of the forecasting and taking into cognizance the shortcomings that you mentioned, Prof, South Africa, though, as a water-scarce country, can we use what we know for government, for example, to build more dams so that we actually have more catchment areas to harvest this water? Because I can't help but think a lot of this water is just going to waste.
Yes, so I think in South Africa, we are to some extent used to very, very pronounced climate variability. So South Africans are used to the La Nina, El Nino cycle, and that includes our water managers and the farmers. So we are a country where we have to be able to cope with seasons of really excessive rainfall, usually linked to the La Nina phenomenon. And then, of course, we get other types of summers that are completely different, where we have a complete lack of rainfall in eastern South Africa. And that's usually when we start to get worried about the Vaal Dam level dropping here in Gauteng, or when the farmers are struggling to get a good maize crop in the Free State, for example. So to some extent, we are used to this variability, but this variability itself is amplified because of climate change. So your question is an important one. What can we do during the seasons of good rainfall? And I think our opportunities to build more dams in South Africa are increasingly limited. We've built many of the dams that we can build already. But what I can say, Sakina, where we have so much to improve on in South Africa is how we manage the water. There's far too much water getting lost that falls in the eastern parts of the country. It gets caught in the big dams. But then due to these infrastructure issues we are all aware of, we are losing about 40% of the water that exists in the integrated Vaal River system on its way to Gauteng, where most of the households are and where the big industries are and so forth. So getting the infrastructure right so that we lose less water, that's very important. And then our own behavior as consumers is really important. Per household in Gauteng, we are using far too much water. So we also need behavioral change. And we are going to need that. It's difficult to imagine it now because most dams in the east are at full capacity. We've had now 5 out of 6 La Nina summers, which is exceptional. But I can mention to the viewers that we are seeing the first signs of an El Nino event emerging, the opposite event. So the early indications is that the summer of 2026-27 will be very different than this summer. And therefore, all people that can also store their own water in tanks at home, for example, should do that because these times of plenty in terms of rainfall in eastern South Africa will not last forever, and we will certainly move into the next drought cycle again.
Absolutely fascinating. And as you say, comes down to our behavior, not just in terms of how we use water, but also with 1 minute left, Prof, to quickly touch on the reduction on our part of greenhouse gas emissions, because I can't help but think this is something we heard a lot about some time ago, but not so much now.
It remains important because if we can't curb these greenhouse gas emissions across the world, global warming will continue to intensify. It's all about burning coal and oil. We should not lose hope because of the current international geopolitics, where the United States, for example, one of the biggest greenhouse gas polluters, are moving away from the quest to reduce these emissions. In South Africa, the main thing we have to do is to transition away from coal to the renewable forms of energy. So that's a national decision. For as long as the country is going to be heavily reliant on coal for electricity generation, we will remain an important contributor in Africa to the global warming process and climate change. All of us, of course, should also reduce our own carbon footprint. And the one thing we can do is to drive less and to drive around in smaller cars and to use public transport where possible. So I think everyone, many households can reduce their emissions just by their patterns of driving around between their houses and work.
Prof, thanks so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it. Professor Francois Engelbrecht, Director of Global Change Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand, speaking to us about South Africa's recent floods that we're seeing in Limpopo and Mpumalanga provinces.